the forces shaping economies around the continent and the world. Today, we turn our focus to Ghana, a nation standing at the crossroads of opportunity and challenge. Fresh off the election of President John Dramani Mahama, the country is poised for a potential reset with an ambitious 26-point agenda that promises bold steps towards economic recovery, fiscal reform, and governance transparency in just, get this, 120 days. But it's not just policy promises grabbing attention. Ghana's economy posted a robust 7.2% GDP growth in Q3 of this year, its fastest in 5 years, even as the nation grapples with a complex public debt restructuring effort. These factors, combined with heightened expectations from citizens and investors alike, create a compelling narrative for what could be a transformational chapter in Ghana's history. Will this be the moment that defines the country's trajectory for decades to come? Well, today, joining us live from Aberdeen, Scotland, to unpack what lies ahead for Ghana, Dr. Theo Acheampong, a highly respected Ghanaian economist and political risk analyst, is here to give us the full gist on Ghana. He's advised governments, international organizations, and private investors. His expertise spans energy policy, fiscal regimes, and political risk across sub-Saharan Africa. He's also a senior fellow at Ghanaian think tank, the Imani Center for Policy and Education, and also an associate lecturer and honorary research fellow at the Aberdeen Center for Research in Energy, Economics, and Finance at the University of Aberdeen. Dr. Acheampong, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome to the show.
Good to see you.
So my first question for you is, your president-elect, I hope I can say that, has a 26-point agenda that he wants to execute, I guess, in 120 days, focusing on economic recovery, governance reforms, and social welfare. Which ones stand out to you as the most urgent, and how feasible is that timeline, given the country's current economic constraints?
Yeah, thank you once again. I think the biggest thing really is sort of the signaling in terms of the intent of the reforms that the government seeks to undertake in the first 3 to 4 months. And within that context, it's all about providing some relief to Ghanaians and then dealing with the bigger issues of, growing the economy. And fundamentally, it comes down to two things: the tax cuts that they're promising within the first 3 months. So, for example, scrapping the electronic levy, which is very controversial, the COVID-19 levy, there's a 10% levy on winnings from your gambling. There's a whole lot of other things, including the emissions levy and import duties that the government incoming has promised to scrap. And then secondly, the other important one is how they re-engage with the IMF in terms of the program going forward.
Yeah.
Because with all of these tax cuts, you also need to make a commensurate, adjustment either on your expenditure side. So there has to be some element of
Absolutely.
fiscal consolidation. And if you look at the IMF program that Ghana is currently under, it's largely sort of revenue-led in that sense.
Okay.
So if they have to give away quite a number of these tax cuts, then we have to see quite a commensurate measure
in
on
revenue
the
growth.
expenditure side of the equation. And this is where the
Sure.
government intends on, for example, the size of the ministries, whether they merge some government departments, and there's some efficiency savings, and all of that becomes really critical.
Indeed, Dr. Acheampong, thanks for that. I think you laid out what was going to be one of my next issues. I remember one of the main talking points around in the run-up to the election and around the campaign was really around governance and government excesses and signaling. And it's that, it's not just Ghana. I think it's across the continent. Here in Nigeria, it's also something that's on the lips of a lot of people. So can you tell us from a governance perspective here, is the president-elect trying to do too much too soon? And will the realism of the politics of economic policy making actually moderate this ambition?
I think that eventually will come probably in the 6 month to 1 year outlook. We've seen that in Nigeria, we've seen that in Kenya, We've seen that to an extent in a few other countries, even outside of the continent. But what is also really important here is that the president has got one of the biggest winning mandates, both on the presidency side and also in parliament, where they've got a supermajority, currently about 188 seats out of 276. So they can actually push through a lot of reforms within the first 6 months. I would not even say 120 days. It's quite foolish, but it's important that they send the right signal. And for many Ghanaians and the people who voted for them, as well as even those who abstained from voting because of the cost of living crisis and other issues, to send a signal that they are with them. And so bringing down the cost of living, those tax cuts becomes extremely important. And that they can easily do within the first 3 to 4 months. But eventually, I think from about the 6th month onwards, the 1 year, that's when the reality begins to set in. So for example, then what that means is that if getting to the latter part of this year, for example, we see a bigger than anticipated budget deficit, then they have to reassess their priorities. They may have to cut back on some of the planned tax incentives that they want to give to businesses, and even things like the cheaper electricity tariffs that they want to afford to drive the 24-hour economy policy.
Yes, indeed. I think that's a very interesting economic policy. And it's an interesting approach. You do the softening first before the hard policies. Some countries do the hard stuff first before the soft one. But let's talk about the GDP growth figures. Q3, not bad at all. 7.2% year-on-year growth in GDP in Q3, driven primarily by the extractive sector, mining and quarrying, construction, oil and gas manufacturing. I mean, this is a high that Mahama can ride on. How can he actually capitalize on this growth to ensure it is sustained and diversified, even beyond non-extractive sectors, to include sectors like agriculture and others?
Yeah, you make a very, very important point about the diversification. That has been the challenge with Ghana and indeed many other African economies for the last 40 or so years. The latest GDP numbers actually come up consistent 3/4 or so of growth, which indicates that things are beginning to pick up in sense at the macro level, with inflation moderating. But there are also major challenges at the micro level, where often those offshoots of the growth that we celebrate and we tout does not necessarily trickle down in terms of the jobs and the employment creating opportunities for people. And this is where the next administration of John Mahama becomes extremely important in terms of how you grow, for example, the non-traditional export sector of the economy. So agriculture as big business or commercial scale agriculture, for example, also how you can leverage or use the Bank of Ghana, the central bank. For a very long time, it's been doing inflation targeting and also sort of using the liquidity management framework. But how can we get them together with the commercial banks to actually get more funding or lending to the real sector of the economy that then creates the catalytic jobs that people actually need and require? Those things require time. It's not going to kind of change overnight, very much like we've seen in Nigeria, even under Tinubu, where some of these reforms, you're looking about 3 to 4 years before you actually see the effect of that coming through.
Yeah, and 3 to 4 years is about the length it takes to get from one election cycle to another. I mean, there's a bit of an elephant in the room here, Dr. Acheampong.
But I think luckily, though, not to cut you, but luckily, though, what Ghanaians also recognize is that the scale of the crisis and what it requires to sort of change them, right, is both economic, but it's also political. So
yes, indeed.
Aspects of the governance reforms, right? Who you elect, who gets onto the cabinet, how you reform the decentralization or the administration of government at the provincial levels. And all these connections are extremely important. And those are other points that we need to consider.
Yeah, and Dr. Acheampong, you make a fantastic point, because I think most logical, everyday Africans will give you a long rope if you're seen to demonstrate proper governance, making the required changes, even where some of the economic policies may mean that we feel the pinch. But you mentioned commercial banks. Speaking of which, the president has proposed some forensic audits into matters of public interest, including the collapse of some local banks. How critical are these audits for restoring public trust? And could they potentially dampen investor confidence or deepen political divisions? Because every new government is always sometimes accused of a political witch hunt. But are these justified, and how do you think this will play out in the Ghana context?
Yeah, in terms of, deepening the political atmosphere, probably even poisoning it, let's put it that way, for sure, because the allegations have been made that some of these banks that were collapsed were sort of favorable or leaned to the NDC, and despite the fact that they had, bad fundamentals on asset quality, and you name it. But the at the time, back in 2016, I recall, there was a report that indicated that the government needed about 9 billion or so to sort of save the banks. And if you go back to the 08-09 financial crisis.
Sorry to cut you. Do you mean 9 billion CDs or $9 billion?
CDs,
okay,
not dollars.
Just wanted to check.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so if you go back to the 08-09 financial crisis, there was this whole troubled asset relief program, something like that, right? And people had advocated for a thing like that to help the banks. Some got some support, others didn't, and eventually the government claimed to have spent about 25 billion Ghana cedis saving the banks. And the way and manner it was done raised quite a number of questions. So, I mean, the NDC is very well within its rights to want to undertake an audit. I think the really key thing is that it has to be fair, it has to be transparent, and it has to respect the rules, such that it sends that strong investor signal that we're all looking for. The key thing, again, for me, is how we can get our banks to start providing cheaper liquidity to the real sector of the economy. Because if I have to go borrow at about 30%, there's no way that I would be able to really break even, and that leads to a catch-22 situation of always servicing the debt with very little available to actually probably even expand my production capabilities.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point. Briefly, can you comment on what Ghanaians will be expecting in terms of the cabinet selections, especially for key portfolios, and those ones that really contribute to the country's GDP, its revenue streams, mining, oil and gas, agriculture? What's the expectation really of what Mahama's NDC will do?
Yeah, I think a number of things. I think probably four things for me. One is really competence. You want tried and tested hands. The scale of the problem and the challenges they've got to do. This is not the time to be playing sort of hanky-panky games. So competence is really, really key. Not just having the education, but having demonstrated in your over the course of your career that you understand that sector and you've been able to show something for it. The second thing is also nation-mindedness. What I mean is people who genuinely are patriotic and care about the country. Sometimes you can have competent people, but if they are corrupt, you end up, losing money, right? Through that angle. And then you also, related to that, have to be fairly kind of technocratic in nature. And then the fourth point I would add is it has to have a broad political appeal. So not just appointing people from the NDC, but people probably out at large from other smaller parties and groupings to send a signal, really, that this is turning the corner and we're in this together and we will deliver it together for the Ghanaian people. Because believe you me, in 4 years' time, if many of these major reforms, especially on the constitutional reforms and then also sort of addressing the cost of living issues are not done, the NDC would find itself in a very difficult place politically.
Indeed, and we've seen that from Ghana's political cycle and the change of government. You know, the incumbents are always tested really hard on their economic policy. You've had so many successive changes, NDC, NPP, and it's been like that for a few years. Let's move on now to some pillars of the Ghanaian economy. I think, I have two final buckets I want to touch on: gold, cocoa, oil. And then I'll come to the debt restructuring and the sustainability of that part of the economy. But tell us about what your outlook is for some of these key sectors. Recently, we saw that for the first time, Ghana's oil output actually increased after a bit of a hiatus and some stagnation. What is your expectation for the gold sector, for cocoa, for the oil sector?
Yeah, so let's start with the oil. Yeah, you're right that there was a bit of a marginal increase, but that's far off from where the country could and should have been by now. If you look at the projections, by now we should have been doing about 500,000 barrels a day, and we're just barely around 130 or so thousand barrels a day because of the sort of for me, investment posture of the incumbent government towards some of the issues that we saw with ENI, the unitization dispute with Springfield, and some tax, additional tax measures that were taken. And this is really, really key if you juxtapose it in the context of the energy transition, right, as well, where, you may possibly see even a lower demand for oil in the years to come. I think what the NDC has indicated very clearly here is that they will seek to resolve those disputes and then open up the sector for investments again. It remains to be seen how that, would play out. On the mining sector, again, there are some sort of carrots that have been thrown to the business and investor community. So they intend to abolish VAT on mineral exploration. And then also a bit of concern is the attempt to sort of renegotiate agreements with mining firms after the expiry on the repatriation of their export proceeds. That one, it's a bit technical, but it remains to be seen how those would go. But fundamentally, within the extractive sector, the idea is to get more investments coming in, both externally, but also with the local partners. And then one small minor point, but important for many Ghanaians, is how the government addresses the issue of the illegal small-scale mining, what's called the galamsey, big problem in the country. The attempt to formalize that and recategorize mining into small-scale, medium, large-scale, and remove the undue political influence also in the award of license.
Dr. Acheampong, sorry to cut you short. I'm just conscious of time, and I wanted us to have time to talk about Ghana's debt restructuring. Even though we haven't really touched on cocoa, maybe a very brief comment on cocoa, and then we can end with talking about the debt restructuring and the opportunities for Mahama in maintaining credibility with creditors and fulfilling obligations under the IMF-supported program.
Yeah. Cocoa production would pick up. Probably from next year or the year thereafter. Some of the weather issues that we saw with El Nino seems to have abated. And I think on the debt restructuring, the three-pronged restructuring is all being completed. So they've done the external bilateral, external commercial, and then the domestic debt exchange. That's all been done. now. The key thing now in terms of credibility and signaling with investors is to what extent does the government incoming meet the conditionalities and benchmarks under the IMF program. And they've actually already indicated that they're going to renegotiate some aspects of it. But two key probably indicators for me for looking going forward is if we see the deficit widening and we also see probably the current account also widening, then it means the government would have to scale back a little bit on some of its spending plans and also more long-term structural transformation in terms of the 24-hour economy and industrial sector.
Yes, and outlook for the CD, very quickly, outlook for the Ghanaian CD vis-a-vis the dollar.
The CD is always difficult to predict.
Indeed.
I wouldn't want to come back to you in 6 months time
no
and
problem.
say, I said how this is, But I think we've seen relative stability. I expect that to continue at least in the next few months. Many market watchers and investors will probably be a bit wary when we get to the half-year mark. So by July, we're going to get the mid-year budget. And the numbers in the mid-year budget would really be indicative of where the CD's performance would be for the latter half of next year.
Yes, indeed. So overall, I mean, look, it's an interesting one. I'm very interested in following the debt restructuring plan and credibility, especially giving all these tax incentives that the government wants to embark upon. It really has to ensure that it can still maintain some level of belt tightening moderately in order to meet some of those conditions. And I will definitely be taking you up on your 6-month promise to return to tell us about the trajectory of the Ghanaian CD. But Dr. Theo Acheampong, thank you so much. It's been excellent having you. As they say in Chui Ayeko, you're doing such great work. You're doing such great work.
Thank you, man.
And hopefully we can have you back. All the best to the newly elected government of John Dramani Mahama. Thank you very much for joining us today.